Welcome to our evening lecture for today. I'm very delighted to introduce to you Professor Michaela Ott. Michaela Ott is Professor for Aesthetics at the University of Fine Arts in Hamburg. She's a philosopher who worked extensively on affect and affectuality. Other fields of her research are post-structuralist philosophy, aesthetics and politics, as well as art and knowledge. And she's one of the most interesting and renowned readers of the work of Gilles Deleuze that I know of personally. So I'm very delighted that I can introduce your new title as well for the lecture of today. It's In Favor of a Disaffected Discourse of Affection. Welcome, Michaela Ott.
Thank you very much, Markus, and thank you very much for still being here. I'm afraid I will offer you a quite philosophical talk at this time of the day. I apologize for that, but this is my profession, let's say. In favor of a disaffected discourse of affection. Around 10 years ago, when I began my study on the concept of affection, I did so with the intention of countering the undifferentiated block-like understanding of affect that has become widespread in academic discourses as a consequence of certain post-structuralist statements. I wanted to introduce a historically differentiated concept that would set the discourse of affect in motion once more, and would also make cultural theory analysis available to it. In this, I saw a genuine task of philosophy, to reconstruct the term both in its historical genesis and systematically as the effect of a certain ontological process and its conceptual cultural codings, which admittedly are confined to the West, and thus to contribute to the developing of a differentiated way of thinking about affect. I proceeded on the basis that the affective should not be understood as an automatic given value, as it was by Aristotle, who listed 11 affects, pathei, and passed this down as a doctrine so that in all through European history up to today, they are largely recapitulated and nowadays used for media regulations and surveillance, as was told to us today. In order to counter this ahistorical and schematic understanding of human subjectivation, I have attempted, with the aid of mainly Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception, to base affect in temporally occasioned micro-processes of affection and to develop affect expression as a time, culture, and media-dependent result of them. Affections, as I understand them, are heterogenetic synthesis and differentiation processes that, in union with the relevant set of cultural codes, are indispensable for the constitution and cohesion of the most widely diverse range of phenomena, from the smallest organism to persons and social constructs, cultures, religions, and artworks. The way in which they unite with aesthetic qualities in order to become perceptible and to achieve effective expression is part of what interests me in my work as an aesthetic theorist. Ever since Gilles Deleuze's emphatic Spinoza-echoing interpretation of affect, which unites physical and media affection processes, Spinoza has both terms, no? Affection and affect, with demands for their intensification and multiplication, affect has become overstrained in academic discourse itself, leading to a de-differentiation of discourse. It is not only that insufficient distinction is made between affects and emotions, affection processes, and affective expression. in the very same way as the affective is used on all sides in the electronic media for advertising and manipulation, for surveillance processes and so forth, so too it is deployed in the manner of a buzzword in academic discourses in a spirit of self-advertising. Resorting to this concept of affect appears in itself to be attractive and timely for the discourse. It is amalgamated with theoretical parameters from anthropology, cybernetics, and post-structuralism from biology, technology, and political science, so that ultimately it can no longer be used. This is why I'm calling for a disaffection of the affect discourse, for as sober as possible an analysis of affection processes which, in our present day, feed into natural, cultural, and sociological science research, frequently without being named as such. I do not have to emphasize that the politics of today is primarily a mediatized affect politics. On the evening of the German federal parliament elections, it was striking that all the party representatives were aggressive in their gestures and pantomimed combativeness, as though criticism and political programs must inevitably go hand in hand with bared teeth. In the TV broadcast, a CDU politician quite justifiably complained that in the televisual media, the focus was most strongly placed upon the far-right AfD party for the purpose of affect production, leading to them receiving the most attention. This evening alone made it clear that the future federal government was in danger of being baited into an affective battle with that party, thereby neglecting other wider and more important political tasks. The discursive equating of affect with intensification, as undertaken by Brian Massumi, maybe by Marie-Louise Angara, becomes a problem when an affect that is recognized as strongly expressive, such as, in this case of Massumi, rage, is feted as a good value since it subversively interrupts normalized interactions. This was a quotation of Massumi. Instead of using the differential potential of affection to give a profile to unknown, inconspicuous, disregarded affect expressions, affective stereotypes are resorted to. Massumi is doing precisely the opposite, in my understanding, of what he has in mind. Instead of using the metamorphotic potential of the affective, which he emphasizes to make epistemological advances, he reaches for post-logo affect expression in order to outline the possibility of subjective restructuring. In my understanding, the potential of the affective lies in precisely the opposite of this, in the bringing forth of new affect articulations of the kind that can sometimes be observed in art practices and in statements that are of more minority character, when they are conspicuous by virtue of a considered ambiguity, they become interesting in an epistemological sense. Point one, affection and affect expression. In order to explain my understanding of affect more precisely, let us quickly revisit its foundations in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. According to him, the potential of affection lies in its heterogenetic character insofar as, identified with temporality, it is supposed to bring itself about by repeating its antecedent infinity and to coalesce in temporal syntheses that are different in each case as a condition of the possibility of anything whatsoever becoming. Affections open up a microstructural field that makes affect understandable as an ephemeral value that is always a composite expression and transforms itself thanks to media coding. In epistemological, political, and aesthetic terms, it is of relevance to the affections that they can bring together that which was hitherto not related and place it in a tension-rich relationship, thereby revealing cross-discipline interferences and generating unknown affect expressions. They also compel one to the insight that affections are to be thought of as non-individual processes manifesting as subsurface powers in many agents simultaneously, crossing between self-contained entities, producing affective associations and participation problems, which I have begun to negotiate under the heading of de-individuation or dividuation. The term dividuation places the accent on the various types of participation, of simultaneous distribution and captures of capacities with which we struggle to learn how to live. It eliminates the "in" of individuation, thus contesting the assumption of undividedness. Individual means undivided of anything at all, because an undivided entity is at best encountered only where violence is deployed, in the realm of identified beings, things, cultures, and so forth. Thanks to actually refined technologies, we can recognize today that the assumptions of indivisible elements is a fallacy, and that everything exists in relationships of interference and affection, even if it possesses a certain coherence and its own affective quality. As has been made clear, I'm building on specific assumptions and terminologies used by Gilles Deleuze, primarily those in his text on the philosophy of film, Cinema 1, the movement image, in which he defines affect expression as, on the one hand, indivisible, and on the other hand, as continuously aesthetically subdividing. As he relates in the subchapter, the affection image, affect expression, precisely because of the time-based character of the filmic medium, does not represent an unchangeable and fixable value. It deplaces the visual and auditive in relation to one another, continuously undertakes other dividuations of the visual elements, constructs intensity sequences between different aesthetic markers, and creates intervals. Deleuze calls this aesthetic procedure, which undermines the opposition of the individual and collective, dividual. Andrew, this would be my answer to the question of this morning. He is particularly interested in the producing of ambiguous affect articulations and plainly in those that cannot be recognized. It is no accident that, like Guattari, he adopts a program of ethics with so-called 3 virtues intended to amount to inconspicuousness, impersonality, and indistinguishability of expression. Thus, both are united by the hope that through the deconstructing of the individual named features, a kind of re-embedding in the social field and the unconscious affections will become possible, a way of speaking that is individual and politically relevant, because it brings to expression unconscious sensation, wishes, fantasies, and so forth. In his late text, Postscript on the Societies of Control, Deleuze recognized the tendency brought on by the digital media to numerically put everything into relation with everything, for instance, human subjectivations with non-human values, such as currency fluctuations and data streams. Against this background, he warned against the becoming individual of the human as the expression of a tendency to adapt effectively to all social demands and to obey the imperative of enhancing performance and economizing one's own abilities. In an era in which every product and also academic discourse seeks media praise and wants to keep itself in view in as high profile and recognizable a manner as possible, the ethical imperative to re-embed oneself back into the social structure through minorizing and aesthetic subtraction has forfeited much of its attractiveness. At the same time, the question of affection makes clear that those who are excluded as non-affiliated also co-affect us, for which reason we are also deviated by them, even if we resist it. Even if they are kept on the other side of the geopolitical boundary drawn by us, they belong to our economy of affection simply by virtue of their wish to reach us. Media affections and the resulting deviations of the human are observable in the bio and socio-technological and political aesthetic realms. They demand that we question the existing drawing of boundaries and compel a considered self-monitoring. Affections contribute to a more complex understanding of the person in that they reveal the person as both voluntarily and involuntarily gripped and entangled. More than a few persons are today fleeing to Wi-Fi free zones where they have no chance of digital affection, as people are already recognizing that their powers of concentration are significantly impaired by constant offers of affections. Since we want to concentrate here on social and political transformations due to affection processes, I want to look closer on socio-technological and aesthetic political affections, which seem of relevance to me under a globally widened and post-colonial informed perspective. Point 2, the socio-technological level. Recent sociological theories outline the new phenomenon of upcoming world societies and the new affective relations by which they are brought about on a globalized scale. Ultimately, the German sociologist Ulrich Beck describes the bringing together of different institutions and initiatives to form a world society as an irreversible development of today that forces agents to participate as undetermined affective multitudes, all the more so since no identity formation of nation-state, cultural society, and individual is any longer possible. I quote, "The unity of state, society, and individual presumed by the first modernity is being dissolved. World society does not mean world state society or world economy society, but a non-state society that is an aggregate condition of society for which state territory guarantees of order, but also the rules of publicly legitimate politics lose their binding character." End of quote. The world society of which Beck speaks appears as an action space of different organizations and single persons, not tied to territories, but tied together by shared affections, interests, or ideologies. World societies aggregate state is inevitably not one, but a individual structure of single and group initiatives, transnational and transcultural connections, boundary-breaking power, and affect relationships. Beck's description of transnational, local biographies of the contact and crossing points of human beings, expanding and propagating in the growing world society, is no longer applicable only to the Western world. Interconnected single agents or organizations lock themselves into various function systems and take part in variously rational medial processes. An NGO or a so-called terrorist group can simultaneously cooperate with different institutions in different locations, in different affective and medial expressions, and can intervene in or bring about various neuralgic points. Organizations of this type cannot be described as units or purely as the sum of their single agents. They are temporary allies with distributed interests and affects, their solidarity with others dependent on faith, deciding jointly on their modes of participation and their willingness to engage, dividing competencies and modes of action, effectively concentrating themselves in articulations and engaging in joint risks. I quote, "With no alternative to cooperation and thus mutually obliged to take account of one another's interests," end of quote, "they extend, partially replacing classical interest representatives such as trade unions, into the decision of public-private organizations in their transverse network operations form new affective socialities. Not only NGOs, but also militant groups such as the ISIS can be considered to be world societies of this type, all the more so since ISIS aims to reconstruct an empire and rejuvenate the Eastern Roman Empire of Ottoman times. For this purpose, the ISIS fighters develop a media effect policy along several lines. They use the internet and their portal Global Islamic Media Front to advertise their state ideology poster fashion and to win youthful and even child recruits for its propagation, but also deploy Western video aesthetics and the US horror film in order to spread fascination and to connect with the perception patterns of young people, especially through familiar aesthetic formats such as Games of Thrones. This fantasy world in which men are massacred, women raped, and children abused is implemented in reality and documented on video. Additionally, they show a consciousness of history, popularizing their planned caliphate under the online magazine title Rumia, meaning Rome, also referencing the identity of Constantinople/Istanbul as a second Rome and as successor to the Roman Ottoman Empire. Attached to this is a target media affection politics. Rumia, the journal, published by the Al Hayat media outlet, which specializes in multilingual publication, has appeared in several languages: English, German, French, Russian, Turkish, Uyghur, Pashtun, and Indonesia. However, the different editions of Rumia don't just differ in their language, but also in their text design, illustrations, content, and extent, and with regard to the short biographies of various ISIS martyrs. The current German edition includes the life history of the killed jihadist Nada H. alias Abu Bilal al-Maghribi from Frankfurt am Main under the title Die Karawane der Shuhada. The English edition mentions the ISIS terrorist commando group that carried out attacks in Bangladesh in July 2016. Additionally, the English Rumiyya begins with a foreword on the situation of the jihadists in East Africa, whilst in the French and the German edition, one finds a direct call for the murder of so-called apostates at this point. The German title is So tötet die Mushkin, wo auch immer ihr sie findet. The French title is Avant-propos, tuez les associateurs où vous les trouviez. Rumiyya thus deviates from the far more extensive Dabiq ISIS magazine, 15 editions of which have appeared thus far, and which would appear to have been produced with considerably more effort, and pursues a different approach. Dabiq is primarily concerned with representing the utopia of Islamic State as extensively and in as much details as possible. The range of subjects covered in its articles includes ideological and theological issues, day-to-day life in ISIS territory, and new reports on current military operations. However, as ISIS has more recently lost territory and access to military bases appears to be more difficult, young disciples are increasingly exhorted to remain at home and to carry out their attacks there. Thus, Rumiyya is primarily concerned with a single topic: the killing of non-Muslims in the West. In essays running to several pages, the jihadists explain why hatred against unbelievers and idolaters is supposedly commanded by Allah and must be accompanied by the most brutal acts, including against civilians in Europe and Northern America. What is conveyed is a positively delusional duty to commit murder, accompanied by descriptions of the advantages of a martyr's death. There are also exhortations to ISIS followers not to give up. For instance, in the German Rumiyya edition, the lead story is put under the heading, "Tell the patient once, Allah's victory is near." Unlike Dabiq, the subject matter has long since moved away from traveling to ISIS territories. Instead, it is concerned with affection, indoctrination, and teaching certain behaviors to future attackers. The message is unmistakable. The killing of non-Muslims is a religious duty. Under the impression produced by destructive transnational initiatives of this type, but also in view of globally organized social inequality, Ulrich Beck draws attention in a late text to the sudden alienness of society. He emphasizes vehemently that, after all, the experience of globality asks for recognition of cross-border distributions of social inequality. The place of territorial, political, economic, and socially established space has been replaced by the ambivalence of co- and multinational action spaces and life circumstances and a contingency of non-concrete boundary constructions. Sorry, this was a quotation of Beck. He even accentuates the fact that, I quote, "the ability and possibility of crossing boundaries has become a significant resource of social inequality in the globalized world," end of quote, thanks to the unequal distribution of access to state welfare institutions, to general security, and a better standard of life with freedom from violence. Beck wishes to take more into account the processes that penetrate the boundaries of nation-states and affect their inhabitants with transnational currents and forces such as climate change, but also, I quote, the incalculability of transnational terrorism and the unilateralism of the world's greatest military power, end of quote. Involuntary affections arise as a consequence of those political decisions that have implications across nation-state boundaries, again I quote. Often it is the case that one exports the danger, either spatially or temporally, to the future of unborn generations. One spares money by transporting the risk to somewhere where the security standards are low and the arm of the law does not reach. This applies to the export of torture as it does to the export of waste, end of quote. Here Beck outlines significant and temporally far-reaching political and economic affections of world populations. They result from the interplay of social need, acceptance of danger, and economic greed, and from the fact that active and passive transnationalizations are distributed to different global regions. For Beck, this does not mean that poor society are not part of or are not affected by world societies, I quote. Rather, the reverse is true. They are the worst affected, owing to the scant resource of silence that they can offer. A fateful magnetism prevails between poverty, social vulnerability, corruption, and accumulation of danger. In the type of the average migrant, Beck recognizes the consummate temporary embodiment of these boundary prophets. As artist of the border, this figure explores an existence form that, in its multiple economic, political, and cultural multiple affections, can by no means be called individual. I quote again, in these forms of life, they are tested in border-crossing opportunities, different national state spaces of social inequality intersect and interpenetrate in this person, end of quote. In view of this development, Etienne Balibar sees a new old affect gaining in strength again. I quote, with globalization, fear is displaced anew. In a certain way, the positions are reversed. It is no longer the capitalists who are afraid of the revolution. Instead, the workers are afraid of competition from the migrants. In this way, the class relationships that imposed boundaries on the constitution of the social national state from outside destabilize at the precise moment when, from within, the boundaries of its universalism are appearing. End of quote. Point 3. The aesthetic political level. I shall conclude by briefly characterizing some contemporary aspects of the aesthetic political realm, which concerns me particularly, in the contrary affection movements. On the one hand, artistic practice is praised for its possibility of affective and conceptual deviations. On the other hand, today artistic praxis itself is increasingly threatened by globalized art market forces and aesthetic standardizations. Even art biennials that promote local and regional art and wish to enhance the value of specific art languages are engaged in an affection contest with biennials worldwide. And yet it is precisely the authors from the global south, such as Achille Mbembe, who praised the global decentralization of art events because it opens up to African artists the possibility of liberating themselves from the African niche to which they have been assigned by the art market to practice cross-cultural affections and to lend themselves a post-ethnic mode of appearance. The Afropolitan aesthetic that he presents as timely is precisely concerned with accentuating spatial-temporal intertwinings and all in all the interwovenness of different art languages. To him, it appears unquestionable that culturally composite forms of expression are the only articulation form appropriate to contemporary circumstances. Numerous authors from the non-Western world argue, in the same spirit, for the de-individualization of the understanding of the subject and the artwork. For instance, the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne hails the terminology of individuations because it indicates that the term individual or the undivided expresses a negation of participation and individuatedness by others, which appears to be no longer appropriate to digitalized times. When one looks at globalized art and discourse events, we see that, even today, it is not only refugees from famine who are excluded as of no concern to our affection readiness, but speakers from non-Western context in general, since our attention is mainly centered upon US symbolic productions. Instead of allowing ourselves to be colonized academically, primarily by US theory building blocks, we should also pay attention to voices from other contexts in order to perceive different articulations and to perceive differently, and to face the unequal division of labor that also exists in the academic realm. Gayatri Spivak and Ray Chow criticized this division of labor and raised the question of why theoretical affection is always directed toward the old centers of knowledge and of prestige. Today, Afropolitans and other cosmopolitan theorists and artists respond to this with a provocative self-confidence. No longer do they deplore their extroversion, their inevitable orientation on Western discourses and globalized aesthetic formats, but instead try to take them over advantageously, to subvert them and to parody them. As an example of this, I would like to conclude with some clips from the film Aristotle's Plot by the Cameroonian filmmaker Jean-Pierre Bécolo, who created this commissioned piece of work for the British Film Institute as the African contribution to the centenary of cinema in 1995. This film develops a hilarious play with the question of what an African cinema could be, with the cineast's affection for an art cinema à la française, and the love of African moviegoers for American action movies. The film also parodies the image of Africa stereotypically produced by the West, as the Aristotelian Hollywoodian film dramaturgy. It questions its conception of narrative patterns, of conventional reactions of the audience, and of the affective reactions of pity and fear, which paradoxically are still often stimulated by images of Africa. So we try to see a little bit of that. The film is called Aristotle's Plot, as I said. Islamic plot.
It all started in the African bush, where I was with my grandfather chewing cola nut. I heard the drums telling me that I had a phone call from London. The British Film Institute wanted me to make a film to celebrate the centenary of cinema. 100 years of cinema. My grandfather wanted to know who else was on their list. Martin Scorsese, Stephen Frears, Jean-Luc Godard, Bernardo Bertolucci, George Miller.
What you're doing, it's cinema. I watch you. I mean, am I making a film? Are you saying I'm stupid?
Be careful. People making films are not stupid. I'm a filmmaker.
Filmmaker? You're a daydreamer. A person is not what he says he is. It's what he does. They call me cinema because I've watched 10,000 films.
Oh, yes? How many of them were African?
Very few, because they shit.
If they are shit, then you are shit, because you're African.
Watching films is not a job. He's a filmmaker. What do you do?
He's a thief, this one.
Shut up! Let me see your ID. Come on!
Then I started wondering, why me? Was it Christian charity or political correctness? Was I accepting a challenge from someone already standing on the finish line? My grandfather spoke to me.
Yes, a movie is a movie.
Silly ass.
Silly ass,
Fuck off.
filmmaker.
Filmmaker, fuck off. Shit, silly ass. Fuck off. Out. Out. Get the fuck out of here.
Silly ass.
I started my research at the root of European storytelling, Aristotle's Poetics. I needed a good story. The setting, contemporary Africa. The protagonist, the filmmaker who inspired me the most, a sombre tourneur. E.T., we called him. When E.T. graduated and came home from France, he was put in jail. E.T. refused to be a puppet. He was an artiste maudit. He thought he was an angel, but he was more like a spirit, an African spirit. How else could he explain the interest the gods took in him? The truth is, E.T. worried them. He was followed everywhere by the police. The government considered him more or less a gangster. After all, the best school for outlaws is and will always be cinema.
Welcome to Cinema Africa. Come into Cinema Africa. And Mario as the family kid.
What's up?
Nikita, sit, baby.
Ginger Potsdam in Hamburg and double impact.
Yo, man, cinema. Yo, sit down.
Van Dam, you.
Sylvester Stallone is Cobra. Coming soon, David.
Cobra. Shift.
Bruce Lee and other drivers. Plazo!
Yeah, stop drinking. Fuck you.
Lee. Yo.
Okay, I will stop here. Can I have a bit of light again? Just to conclude, in one of its significant achievements, Documenta 14 in Kassel and Athens opposed such stereotypical cultural attributions. The African is no longer exhibited as a dancing curiosity. Instead, paintings, bronze sculptures, and sound installations of African artists were displayed. Okpo has the current stock market prices performed by a choir. Bonaventure Ndikung, who had particular responsibility of the acoustic side of the Documenta, talked about the need for new, deep listening and included the radio program as a direct affection medium into the overall plan. The concentration upon the auditive contains an implied criticism of the commodification of art, but also an affection offer through neglected oral techniques. Mbembe signals with his last book, Critique of Black Reason, that the Africans of today should no longer be associated with physicality and emotionality mainly. The Black Reason is attributed not to a specific ethnic group, but explicitly to all of those who, regardless of their origin or color, are excluded from the value creation chain and victims of the striation of the world according to economic and affective non-participation criteria. It offers itself as a disaffected capacity for the negotiation of affective, symbolic, and economic individuation possibilities. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this exceptionally rich talk, which not only gave us a probably well-deserved kick in the groin for the affective concept, but reminded us that affect, as well as emotion and feeling, are Western concepts that are completely disintegrated today via media transformations. One of the points I would like to ask about, but I wouldn't interfere if there are already some interventions or questions. Serge?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I'm kind of overwhelmed by all these different ideas, and I would like to ask, I was irritated a little bit when you talked about, and you used the term being colonized. Academia would be being colonized by, for example, US-American theory blocks. How this relates to what you explained about the idea of world society. Is the concept of colonization, as you used it in this example, is this in sync with thinking of world societies as you presented it, for example, with ISIS? Or is this idea of colonization too old because it refers to boundaries that are actually not in the same function anymore?
Of course, I use this term provocatively. No, it's clear. I know that we, on the one hand, need also this lingua franca of the English language for the moment being, since we have no other possibility of communicating even with people from non-Western countries. This is one of the predicaments of this situation. But I would say the world society is something beyond these Western organizations of powers. I mean also the Cold War powers, which still somehow divide the planet, so to speak, with their money, with their arms, and so on and so on. I would like to see the world societies to be a more differentiated organization and a more widespread, where people from other continents can contribute on an equal level or exchange among each other informations and whatsoever on a more equal level than it has been taught to us in former times.
Yeah, thank you for a really provocative talk. And I was very happy to see the turn to Mbembe and Africa at the end. I too have a little bit of problem with Beck's World Society in that it does seem also like a kind of colonialist application to the South, in the same way that the book by the Komarovs called Theory from the South also seems to me a problematic, if well-meaning, attempt to try to show how critical theory in the South comes up with Western or Northern concepts and therefore is valuable. But I think, turning to Mbembe's work is really important. Also, sometimes his work on media, when he talks about media and technology, is also interesting. And I think one of the things I liked about the clip you showed from cinema is that it reminds us that I think if we think a little bit about technology from the South, we also find a way to resist a certain kind of globalized argument about digital media. So I had a Brazilian graduate student working with me a couple of years ago, and he was working on the Brazilian concept of gambiarra, which is a concept similar to our notion of a hack. And gambiarra in Brazil is something that's used when the technology from the South is not able to connect seamlessly with the technology from the North because of unequal economic divides and unequal technical possibilities. And therefore, it leads to a certain kind of creativity in the Brazilian, in particular, he worked on video game world, because young people had to find hacks in order to connect their technology in the South with the sort of global technologies, video games from the North, soccer, football games being in particular an interest. So what I liked about this cinema was not so much what I liked was the sort of the technology that was shown, the technology of the theater or of the screen there, which was on the one hand less smooth or powerful than the North and could be seen as somehow deficient. But actually, on the other hand, you could see that inconsistency in economic and technological power, let's say, the North and South, led to a kind of creativity that I think was really valuable and important. And I think that that's part of what Mbembe is about in his project as well.
This film is very ironic. I mean, it offers a lot of possibilities to really laugh. I mean, he makes jokes as well of the Europeans and of all the producers who give him the money and ask for certain formats and so on, but at the same time of the Africans themselves, as I showed, they like to present themselves as Schwarzenegger and so on. So the critique is on both sides, which is nice. I don't know for the concept of world society, maybe it's a too unifying concept again. Maybe we have even to cancel this one and find something else, maybe a individual society, I don't know. But for me, nevertheless, it was an interesting concept to conceive of organizations which are widespread all over the world and not confined to nation states boundaries, something else which lives of interconnections, digital interconnections, of course, mainly, but then also of interests, effects, and, ideologies probably. It depends on what kind of world society it is.
Right. I guess my concern was that the world society could lead us to a kind of undifferentiation that you were I think rightly critiquing in regard to affectivity in the first part of your paper.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, focusing on the specificity of the South, and not just of the South as a whole, but actually of Africa or of Brazil or of other parts of the South, is really an important way for us to begin to think. So.
Yeah, thank you.
I personally really liked the notion of an undetermined affective multitude, which replaces the old subject that we all wanted to get rid of in the first place. So is there, and I really like that you came back in a way to a notion that we had earlier, as a certain kind of affective theory, as a kind of, proto-fascist kind of theory of a bewegter Volkskörper, as Matthias was quoting. What you are proposing, I think, is a kind of you're proposing a kind of dystopian community of individuals who are connected by being disconnected. You know, it's not just a paradoxical kind of a joke that I want to make here, but I think that there's a key to understand certain communities, community effects, online communities that are not communities in any sense that we have conceived of before, in any sociological or political sense, but there are communities nonetheless who are bound by concepts or by Stimmungen, by moods, by certain moods that come from this particular kind of affective disconnection or dissolving of the old kinds of connection.
Can I write this down, maybe, as a quotation of yours?
Would this be a kind of a direction you would like to aim with your approach?
Yes, of course. I mean, the whole question of individuation aims at a description of personal engagements in different directions at the same time, building up different sorts of socialities or engagements which then are shared with different persons, but also in limited temporal frames.
Yeah.
No? I mean, we all know that we at the same time very often share with different people different things. So we divide ourselves or individuate, as I would say, ourselves sometimes simultaneously in different directions, having run different screens at the same time. I discover myself that I have sometimes three screens running at the same time, which means that we also orientate our attention in different directions at the same time, or our capacities, our sensory capacities in different directions, but also forming, of course, temporal communities or temporal assemblages. Mm-hmm. So, what did you say, which are individuated, or what did you say, which are
individuated,
not coherent somehow?
Yeah, it's both a kind of attachment or bondage, but with no real grounding, so to speak. Whatever real means in this term. There's some kind of very avant-garde notion to a very conservative kind of communities. I don't know if I make myself clear. I'm thinking about some very simple things. Our online persona. The effect of discussing something online in the disguise of anonymity brings forth kinds of our own person that we would never act out in the real world, so to speak. This is something that is very prevalent, and this somehow explains things like this whole hate speech phenomenon, which was proliferated by digital media, of course, which is not. I'll stop there. But I think there are many connections to this kind, to a kind of explanation of this, without always referring to a positive concept which then could be viewed in the arts. Yeah. It's not just the arts. It's an everyday new form of individuation where no individual is possible anymore.
Yeah, thank you.
But sorry, Sayosha, yeah.
I would like to point to the theme of politics that you had at the beginning of your talk. I think you said something like that all politics are now mediatized, affective politics. And this made sense for me when you said it, but now I'm asking myself if this also was meant provocative, and if there are any alternatives to this mediatized, affective politics that you want to point to, or that you would see as an alternative.
Well, of course, this is again a provocatively uttered statement. No, I hope that not all politics are mainly affective, mediatized politics, or are mainly driven by affective aims. No, it was just obvious after the election that all of a sudden, of course, the most problematic point was put forward in order to create as many attention as possible, and it was obvious that effects were created within this TV set. No? So this was somehow emblematic for me in this very moment. But nevertheless, of course, I hope that at least German politics are not always guided according to affective lines or affect-producing effects. Let's say it this way. But in general, we see that the media offer us as news, mainly the catastrophes of the day. I mean, it becomes more and more obvious now that they are in a kind of embarrassment if there's not a huge catastrophe or a terrorist attack or something like that to open up the news of the day. So I have unfortunately the impression that it goes more and more into this direction. While, of course, not mentioning a lot of catastrophes which are happening at the same time. No, it's again a distribution of attention to the headlines which we consider effect-producing and important for us. So, yeah.
Other remarks or questions? I know it's late, but it's worth it.
I can also show more of the clips. I mean, we can go on seeing the film.
Well, I think this concluded a day that was very critical about the concept of affect in the first place. We seemed to reach a point where we're not just getting tired of a notion, but we arrived at a critical point where a critical notion of affect has to be conceived, and there are many elements for a theory of a critical affective turn. If it still could be called affect is another question entirely, but this is a question for another time, perhaps for tomorrow.
Exactly.
Thank you, Michaela Ott.
Thank you very much for still being here.
Thank you very much.